We're back. We have another new show for you. I'm really excited about this one. This was like a weird thing that happened because I posted an image of like some different books I've been doing research on, and then the author showed up in the mentions for it and to tell everyone how great of a book it is. I agree, it's a good book. It's Daniel Bessner, and he's written a book. It's called Democracy in Exile. And it's about Hans Speer, who's a very interesting guy. It's a great book, actually. I really liked it. I'm really excited to talk to you about this one. So thanks a lot for coming to talk about it.
No problem. And I just want to also thank on Twitter at Bath Robespierre, a brilliant up and coming scholar who actually sent me the image of my book and my joke response. So I just wanted to thank that person and let them know, let everyone know that she brought us together.
So, how long how did you? This guy Hans Speer, he's not very well known by anyone. I mean, usually, both on the left and the right, you have like this whole thing where it's like the Frankfurt School, and they just suck all the air out of all the discussion about everything else. So, if you read something like even like Grand Hotel Abyss, that biography is like none of this sort of stuff is talked about at all. So this guy in popular consciousness, he doesn't really exist. But then your book sheds a whole light on this whole other side of it, to the fact that there's actually he's one of a few hundred such people who came over to the United States, and these people were involved in a lot of wartime and post-war intellectual activities in the defense and security communities and foreign policy and things like that.
So I think that's a really important question, or at least an observation, is that the Frankfurt School, and who are we referring to? Probably most people are familiar with Walter Benjamin or Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, and probably a little less familiar with Max Horkheimer, Franz Neumann, Otto Kirchheimer, Friedrich Pollock, and Erich Fromm was part of the Institute, but these are the main figures. And basically combined, these people formed a coherent intellectual group that came of age in the Institute of Social Research at the University of Frankfurt, migrated within Europe in the early 30s before moving to Columbia University in the mid to late 30s, and becoming really important intellectuals, I would say, in the 1970s and beyond, primarily because Herbert Marcuse and his One-Dimensional Man became a paradigmatic text for the new left in the 60s. And that was both true in the United States and in the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany. Now, some scholars, for example, a scholar named Thomas Wheatland in his book Frankfurt School in Exile, have actually questioned the degree to which the new left has actually read.
That's what I used, that one. That's the one that I thought told a more plausible kind of story about it.
Which is less influential. And so he argues that Marcuse, if I recall correctly, wasn't as influential. But anyway, I think that in the American Academy, at least, I believe Martin Jay's book, The Dialectical Imagination, which came out in 1973 and was very popular, was really influential here because it basically was a summary of the Frankfurt School's major writings in the 30s and the 40s, and I think to some degree in the 50s in English, right? So by providing essentially a précis of all of these works and scholars' works in English, Jay really helped influence the direction of the American Academy, and the Frankfurt School became really popular. But in so doing, and one more thing, I also think that the turn to theory that began in the American and French academies in the 70s was really influential in bringing the Frankfurt School to the prominence that it has, because basically the major people that became popular were the philosophers of the Frankfurt School. I mean, Benjamin, not officially part of it, but associated with it, and also Adorno and Marcuse, while the sociologists of the Frankfurt School, particularly Neumann and Kirchheimer, were shunted a little bit to the side. And this became true of a lot of the exile community who were more sociological focused. So there's Hans Speyer, someone I focused on, but also a bunch of other people associated with Speyer at the New School for Social Research, like Hans Staudinger, Hans Simons, people that no one has ever heard of, but were really important in setting the intellectual agenda of their time, have been basically pushed aside for the Frankfurt School. So when I was writing my dissertation, what I wanted to do is help, along with many other scholars like Alfons Zollner and Udi Greenberg as well, reframe the intellectual generation, the exile generation of intellectuals, and focus that it was, and argue that it was actually a more capacious group than people have understood. And there's actually a lot of really important insights. And if you're in fact looking for like direct influence on American life, I would say
way more influential, I think.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Outside of the academy, the people I focus on have far more.
What you're saying, it raises a bunch of points in my mind of, first of all, you can look at like, another big figure that was so prominent in this, so-called New Left was C. Wright Mills, and he was like a sociologist in the tradition of Mannheim. If you read his book, have you done your research on that one, or is that?
Yeah, I've read all of Mills. Mills was actually very connected to these people.
Yeah. I mean, he wrote a book called The Power Elite, and it's like sort of in its way the first study of the quote unquote deep state or whatever you want to call it, but. It's a very important book for the New Left, but that is a book of that's not a leftist book. And it's explicitly framed as a study in the sociology of knowledge, and it draws on Karl Mannheim, and it's much more like Weberian. It's not a leftist work, and so it's just like there's something wrong about the narrative that just strikes me here, because if you in that one book you did reference, the Frankfurt School in Exile, the story that they tell in that one is more like the Frankfurt School were a bunch of like losers who couldn't find a place in the United States, and they went around and like wrote letters to everyone they knew in the United States, like asking by hook or by crook, can you like find an institution to host us? And no one really wanted to. And so like Columbia was kind of like a last ditch effort for them.
Yeah, and the Frankfurt School, they also had real estate investments. And it's actually interesting. I believe that their real estate investments were really critical, particularly in the early years. I believe they funded quite a bit of themselves. Like I'm pretty sure Columbia wasn't like, here's $100,000 to fund everyone. They were privately funded. I mean, also famously, another interesting class distinction is that from my understanding, from my recollection, the class position of the Frankfurt School scholars was actually of a higher class, generally speaking, than the New School scholars. Certainly of a higher class than Speyer. I mean, Horkheimer was, I believe, the son of an industrialist, owned several factories. But I mean, that's fine. But also, not to judge them. We can't, choose where we're born. But there's just a lot of more interesting things going on in these exile communities than I think people have been privy to by the exclusive focus on the Frankfurt School. And I also think one thing that I was trying to do in the book is revive this other community of exiles, because the community of exiles that I focus on, which clustered around the New School's University in Exile, founded in 1933 and really made the New School, what it is today, an intellectual, a really intellectual space.
So yeah, there's like this weird, for people who don't know, there's just like this weird building in New York. It's called the New School. You'll walk by it, it's very prominent, and it's why is it the New School? Like, what is it? It sounds kind of, artsy fartsy bullshit kind of thing. And I think a lot of people probably have only heard of it in connection to like its Masters of Writing program or something like that. But in the early like World War I, around that time, there was a big drive to train new kind of like social administrators, like technocrats, basically, to run the 20th century, post-industrial society. And so the New School was set up as one of those efforts, and it was made as a sister school to the London School of Economics, which was, established by the Fabian Society, right?
So, well, yes and no. So initially, the New School emerged from when two Columbia professors, James Harvey Robinson, and the other one's escaping me right now, but I used to know, were actually basically dismissed from Columbia for refusing to sign a loyalty pledge during World War I. And while this was happening, there was this whole movement of progressive social science. And so the purpose of the New School was twofold. One, it was, like you said, to create, to help train technocrats. And two, it was also intended to be a place for workers to, become educated in the new means of social science so that they would be able to take control of their lives. And I've never heard of them being officially, that is the New School being officially associated with the LSE, but it was.
No, they're not officially. There's actually, I'll send you a PDF of it or something. There's a really good book, a whole study of it, that especially focuses on the Alvin Johnson, who was the.
Yeah, are you talking about the new Judith
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, I forget her name. Friedlander book.
Yes.
Yeah, I have. Yeah, well, we don't have to get into the details of that, but I think there was this transatlantic movement of which the New School was a part, and Brookwood Labor College was a part. The Hochschule für Politik in Germany was a part. The London School of Economics was a part, which is basically, these progressive institutions mean different things in different contexts, but broadly progressive, wanting to train workers and the new technocrats of modern society. And the New School was a part of that. And just to briefly link what I was saying, one thing that I found so interesting about the people at the New School was that they were oftentimes veterans of actually Weimar era actual politics, right? They were actually in the Social Democratic Party. They were, which is different from the Frankfurt School. They actually held government positions. They actually tried to, work a Marxist political party in a democratic political system, which separated them from the Frankfurt School, which was always more confined to the academy. And so they had different concerns because, in some sense, they had different concerns of more practical governance, which is why so many of them entered the American state in various ways.
Yeah, and then there's also the whole aspect of it where this was all founded out of the New Republic magazine. Like, this was also a related project to that.
Right.
And
exactly.
And so when you say like the word progressive, it's like kind of misleading because I don't really think it doesn't have that much to do with necessarily the everyday understanding of what that means today. But these were like people who, going back to, before the war, before the purge, before Stalinism, and people who were very interested in sort of the mass science of, economic engineering as like that was their idea of progressivism.
Right. So basically, you could understand the progressive movement at least in the United States, as a response to like party bosses and things like Tammany Hall, right? Which was that they didn't like sort of the way municipal governance was run, and what they wanted to do was rationalize it in a meaningful way. And this had both, positive aspects, like you want things like rational municipalization of utilities, and also negative aspects, like you believe in eugenics. So, you had right wings and left wings of the progressive movement, but I think what united them was this idea that society could, in a meaningful way, be scientifically managed, and that you could use new intellectual tools to do that.
Yeah, I mean that was the whole dream of it. I mean, this is why the social sciences came into existence. I mean, today they're
right.
Totally denigrated. As a scientific enterprise of any kind, but back then, that was the vision of them of why they came into existence. I mean, when like Max Weber or another early sociologist, I mean, that was the background they were working from. They were coming from a methodological perspective of, philosophy of science and like what can we know and materialism, and really thinking about these questions of like what's possible for us to even study. And this sort of like sociology, it did die. Like it failed, basically. I mean, at least in the immediate post-war years, it fell apart, I think. So this doesn't really, now it doesn't exist anymore. But for a long time, this was this big project that everyone was working on, especially during that era. So that's sort of how the whole exile like crossover happened, was that they were all working on an encyclopedia for the social sciences, right? And they
right.
And that was being funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, and so there was a lot of like interest from the state and from private foundations and from corporations and from all these different entities to use the social sciences to optimize society in some way on a very large scale.
Right. That was the big hope. And you're referring to, rightly, a project that began in the 20s and continued into the 30s called the Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences, which was edited officially by E.R.A. Seligman, who I believe was an economist at Columbia. But it was really, the yeoman's work of it was undertaken by Alvin Johnson, who was a student of Seligman's and who was the president of the New School for Social Research, and who was the guy who was basically created the university and exile and was able to bring all these exile scholars over from Germany. And in so doing, really transformed the American social sciences, right? Like, so in my book, I focus on Hans Speyer, who was very influential in propaganda during World War II and helped create the Rand Corporation after the war, what it became, at least in the social science division. But also people who came to the New School were like Leo Strauss, Erwin Panofsky, and a bunch of Bronislaw Malinowski, Claude Levi-Strauss, a bunch of people who were incredibly influential. And the New School actually saved more scholars from Germany than any other institution of American higher education.
And they were like, this is also can be thought of in terms of self-interest too. I mean, it's not just a pure generosity factor of wanting to save people, although I'm sure they all had humanitarian beliefs. But, you know, from a larger institutional perspective, it was like this was a huge intellectual resource that they wanted to basically, you know, bring over and exploit as soon as possible.
Right.
And, you know, they had, you know, this was a big interest. Like, people didn't really know what was going on in Germany, and it sort of started to come out. And you had, you know, an American social scientist, a sociologist named Talcott Parsons, who was like the biggest sociologist in America. And he was sort of like a big fish in a small pond kind of thing, because he was able to go over in the 1920s and study in Germany with people like Karl Mannheim. And then he came back to the United States. And, you know, you had these situations when that happened, people would come back and they would say, wow, you know, look at what they're doing in Germany. And that's actually been like a long-term thing throughout the 19th century, is that there has been a lot, you know, not a lot, but these kind of weird crossovers of, you know, German social scientists coming over to America or things like that.
Yeah.
Especially because I guess because of the you know 1848 and the exiles and things like that. So this was, you know, by the 1920s. I mean, people were really like, they were picking up on something, especially in Germany with sociology, that was happening, that they thought like they understood that there was a lot of potential there that they wanted to get at.
Right. And Daniel Rogers, and I believe his name is Axel Honig Springer. I forget his name, unfortunately. But they've charted the exchanges between Germany and the United States between like 1880 and 1940. Particularly Rogers' book Atlantic Crossings is about that. And what you see is that American social scientists spent a lot of that period, roughly 1880 to 1940, studying in Germany and, you know, learning a lot of techniques of research. And particularly theory was always bigger in Germany than it was in the United States until, you know, the exiles come over in the 30s and the 40s. So a lot of social theory is really developed in Germany. It's the vanguard of that. You know, if you think about the founders of American sociology, today generally pointed to, you have Auguste Comte, you have Karl Marx, you have Max Weber, you have Emil Durkheim, and then you have Parsons, right? So you can see 4 of the 5 of those are European, and Parsons, someone who studied at Heidelberg University in the 1920s. So American social science is really made European in the mid-century period, from I'd say 1935 to 1965 is the story of the Europeanization of American social science. And the people that we had just talked about, the New School people, the Frankfurt School people, are really critical to that. And if I recall correctly, actually it's Goethe and C. Wright Mills who translate Weber.
Yes.
In their sort of like collection from Max Weber. And also it's Edward Shills and Louis Wirth of the University of Chicago who translate Mannheim's Ideology and Utopia. So there's a process of literal translation happening in the 30s that's very influential in the course and direction of American social science.
And at the same time, it's like we kind of like vulgarized it too. Like we kind of like fucked it up, because, you know, we wanted the goodies, so we brought all these people over here, and we sort of like raided the coffers, right? And we got all the you know, little cool things we could use for social engineering and for, you know, defense research, and, you know, and we just took it all, and then we sort of like corrupted it in a way, I think, very deeply. You know, we very much sort of like you know, harnessed it to the ends of, you know, this larger neoliberal like economic project that kind of, you know, corrupted the pure the theoretical aspect of it, of wanting to, you know, understand society as an abstract entity.
Yeah, I think when these processes of translation and transnational connection happen, what usually happens is that the original context of the debates are deracinated. So like when Weber and Durkheim are writing in the 1890s or the 19aughts or whatever it may be. They're responding to a very particular set of concerns that are connected to what's going on in their own individual nations, Germany and France respectively, what's going on in Europe, what's going on in their own emergent fields of sociology or economics, which are like not so disconnected at that time. And then when they come to the United States, they're totally deracinated from those various contexts, which always happens in processes of translation. And then certain things are picked up on, certain things aren't picked up on. But it's a difficult thing to translate an intellectual agenda.
Well, this is what I liked about your book, because you brought like this biographical aspect of it out with a whole typology of like the defense intellectual, right? Mm-hmm. And sort of like I think that in the biography of some of these people, they go through that kind of like defense intellectual process where they're, it's kind of a process of liberalization. I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but it's like they experience this wartime, effect where they have gone through this big tragedy that they've witnessed, that they had to sit out in America. And they had to leave everything behind and resettle. And then, you get into the post-war years and they have this never again kind of attitude, I guess, of where they I don't know if you can call them conservative, that they became more conservative, but they became more attuned to the fact that a lot of these social engineering processes needed to be put in place in order to basically defend what had been,
right,
saved and set up.
Right. So the story that I tell in my book, and I think this is a more general story one could tell of sort of the North Atlantic world, which as I become, I guess, older and learn more and more, I think that it's meaningful to speak of from Germany west to the United States as comprising one singular polity, for a variety of reasons. If you were to look at it from a macro historical perspective, there's a lot of connections there, even if not formal governance connections, which don't really exist until after 1945. But they're meaningfully, I think, part of the same world, in a sense that they're fighting over the same questions of modern governance. And the story that I trace in my book is basically the disillusionment of young social democrats with the promises of social democracy and what came to that. Most importantly, I think it's crucial to emphasize is that I don't think the left-right dichotomy that we take for granted today, or that really became relevant in the 1970s and beyond with the ideological sorting of the two political parties in this country, necessarily maps onto the convictions of people earlier.
It doesn't at all. It doesn't. I mean, I've been talking about this a lot. I mean, just with the whole idea of like there was no such thing like pre-war as a conservative in the United States. That whole identity and idea didn't exist, and it didn't start existing until Russell Kirk and William F. Buckley Jr. and all like that. All that was so astroturfed. Congress for Cultural Freedom, like that whole identity came about later. It doesn't really apply to anything that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends, like what you want to. I mean, like I think one can meaningfully say some sort of conservative something started with Burke.
Yeah, but you just have to be clear that has nothing to do with the conservative identity as it's understood politically today.
I think what you're saying and what I agree with is that what had become modern conservative identity in the United States is a reaction to several things. I think the two most important are the rise of the New Deal state and the reactionary conservatism of fascism. And so American conservatism essentially has to deal with those two major historical transformations, and what we get from dealing with that is what we consider like modern American conservatism. So I agree with that. And like what Edmund Burke was talking about in response to the French Revolution is not the same thing, even though there's some ideas there. So I completely agree with that. But what I'm tracing in my book is sort of the disillusionment of social democrats who essentially begin, I think, or what I argue in the book is the primary disillusionment with among social democrats in the middle of the 20th century and slightly earlier is that the promises of democracy failed. So if you look back at the 19th century and what a lot of people are writing, what would come to form but let's say this transatlantic left and really the German left, is this idea that democracy will ultimately lead to the victory of socialism, because once workers are given the opportunity to vote, they're going to vote for their economic interests, right? And there are two big moments that seem to give the lie to this claim. The first is World War I, because the working classes of Europe agree to fight the aristocrats' war, and they fight each other. And then the second moment is Hitler. The rise of Hitler, which rightly or wrongly, I think the story is complex, and historians have argued on various sides, but at least at the time, and I don't want to get into that historiographical debate, but at least at the time, the rise of Hitler is read as in some significant way, not a total way, but as some significant way, a function of working class support for Hitler. And how you define the working class is contested, blah, blah, blah. But those two moments, the workers fighting each other in World War I and the rise of Hitler as being attributed to the working class, are really critical moments for young social democrats. And I think push them to a more elitist politics. And I think the outcome of this elitist politics, and we can get into the details of it, but in some significant sense, why the Cold War state is ultimately, I think, a liberal left project, is because those on the more left side of that equation are fundamentally disenchanted with democracy as a road to progressivism. And I think that is actually one of the fundamental principles of modern liberalism that we see time and again, is a fundamental distrust of the quote unquote masses. And so I think the story of liberalism since, let's say, 1935 has been to construct institutions, whether the European Union or the Rand Corporation, that essentially remove certain decisions, particularly high-level economic and high-level national security decisions, from any sort of public or even parliamentary accountability. And that is the cause of World War I and Hitler.
And this is so well documented. It's just like
the cause from,
it's not even like that it shouldn't be like this radical revelation to say this or anything, because you can easily track all this stuff. I mean, it's in Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere by Habermas. I mean, the whole point of all of this, of what happened, was exactly that. You could describe it as a form of elitism, but the idea is that basically a mass consensus generation wasn't possible under the conditions of a post-industrial society, and that that couldn't be coordinated in a meaningful way to basically create a consensus from which policy could be made in a meaningful, coherent way.
Let me just briefly interrupt. I think what you're saying is true in a sense. I think that people arrive at the same conclusion from different perspectives. Some people will argue that ordinary people are simply too stupid, right? Some people will argue that society is too complex. Some people will argue that capitalism is arranged in such a way that no mass consensus could be reached, right? But the important thing, I think, to emphasize is that this mode of thought, or the general conclusion, is reached across the political spectrum, or what becomes the mainstream politics, let's say center left to center right, which is that people can't arrive at their own decisions. And I think that's the critical conclusion to emphasize.
And so they did explicitly take that direction when they're starting to map things like game theory. I mean, that's the whole premise of it. It does sort of like, it begins from a lot of anti-human, anti-freedom, anti-democratic, axioms, basically, about rational choice and about, the essentially, mechanical way that people make decisions, and how we're basically just, economic computers that, take different inputs and calculate how many utils, we get for different procedures or outcomes that we generate, right? So, I mean, that's the whole idea of when we talk about this, managerial, technocratic aspect of it, is that all of our leaders are the people who understand how that works, right? They go to these elite institutions, University of Chicago, or they study at the Party Rand Graduate School for Public Policy or anything like that, and they learn about all these different ideas and techniques and game theory and systems analysis, and then they use that to govern us and to design institutions and policies that basically lead us around in a way that is satisfying to us in the ideological sense. It creates, an illusionary kind of maze of behavior that simulates democracy while achieving the outcomes that, the so-called elite that they have come to desire.
Right, which links directly, of course, back to the progressive project, right? Like, this is just the apotheosis of that project, to use new techniques of social science or scientific management to manage and govern society. And I think as this is happening, another crucial thing to understand is something sort of the world you and I grew up in, is that democracy becomes defined downwards as voting, right? Like to be a democratic citizen is to vote, i.e. to choose the elite that is going to govern you. So I think you see this as this is happening, as this sort of socio-technical institutional building process is happening, as places like RAND are being created, as techniques like game theory or systems analysis are being refined. You also have the ideological defining down of democracy, where it's essentially just becomes about choosing your elite, right? And this winds up in today where we have, this liberal obsession with like vote. You must vote. That is the most important thing a Democrat could do is vote. And I think that is just a function of this process that we're talking about, which occurred over the course of the mid-century United States, which created, I think, an essentially elite polity, and an elite polity that I believe is unique. And I want to write about this more seriously one day. But I think you can only understand the American state by taking into consideration its private aspects, right? Like the outsourcing of scientific research or weapons research to a place like the RAND Corporation, which is nominally not part of the state, but is in actuality totally funded by the state and totally geared towards state preferences. So that's where I think you have the.
I mean, and this is the crazy part about it. Because if you actually look, you can go on the RAND Corporation website right now and get the PDF of this book, economics and the economics of defense in the nuclear age. And you can get the book and you can read it. And this was like the main kind of like policy manual that they used, especially by McNamara. It was favorite of his. It became the policy of his whole, Defense Department. And the whole idea of this systems analysis is like, okay, if we're fighting a nuclear war, or if we're going to fight a nuclear war, our strategy just can't include like which city to bomb. It has to be a comprehensive strategy of where we're engineering all of society basically to be optimized in such a way to win a nuclear war, and including what scientific research we do. And so our creation of all these institutions, like the National Science Foundation, that the point of those sorts of projects. We hear about them today, and we have public debates about their functionality, and we feel all lovey-dovey, warm inside because, we fucking love science, and so the government loves science, and that's good, right? But, the whole thinking behind the creation of something like that was, okay, well, we have to manage all, scientific production of, ideas and theories and scientific systems. We have to manage all that and direct it and fund it in such a way that's optimized according to our central theory in order to, achieve victory in this Cold War or to win a possible nuclear war.
And that's and the story of the National Science Foundation and the creation of the RAND Corporation are really intimately connected. And I'll actually have a piece coming out about this in an academic book next year. But it's interesting because it winds up. So I think the in some sense, the American state is a melding of both progressive, like I talked about earlier, capital P, progressive movement, and a conservative politics. So you have the progressive aspect, which is that like everyone kind of accepts that social science is a meaningful thing and that you're able to, in some meaningful sense, plan and coordinate things like scientific research. But where conservatives like Vannevar Bush come into play is that they agree with that, but they also don't want it to be directly funded by the government, right? The idea is that like scientists should have some form of independence and that these institutions should have some form of independence. So what happens is you have the creation of these like these private groups, right? And that's where the conservative aspect comes in. The fact that the RAND Corporation is not the Department of Research and Development at a cabinet level, right? It's not an executive body, but is this
the Ford Foundation paid for it. It's okay.
Right. But the thing is, like, so for example, like all of RAND or the overwhelming majority of RAND's research is funded by the government, but it's not subject to Freedom of Information Act requests. Right. And that's where like the conservative politics come in and the anti-democratic politics come in as they're melded with this progressive impulse to use like the techniques of scientific management to make things more efficient. And ultimately, I think it's important to underline there's a moral argument here. It's to make things more humane. So I believe Charles Hitch, I might be wrong, but I think he's the one who wrote that Economics of Nuclear Defense.
Yeah, he is.
Piece. But Charles Hitch, even though he doesn't talk about this, if you ask him what he's doing, he's like, I'm actually a humanitarian, right? I'm saying we're not going to have just all-out nuclear war, we're going to be like very strategic about what we bomb, and that's not only to save American lives, but also to save Soviet lives, or whatever the case may be. And there's a deep military history about that, about viewing.
It's crazy. This drives me so crazy. If you listen, you can go listen to like McNamara talk about like this exact same thing for like hours. He'll just go on and on about it. And like every interview and like in Fog of War, he just loves to like rationalize and like talk about, the reasons behind, firebombing Japan and things like that. It's, from the perspective of these people, they are sort of, they're following a higher rational thinking about this sort of thing that's designed to optimize the outcome for the parties involved, and even if that optimization includes choosing how many people to die.
Right. And so this is actually a long-standing tradition in American history, right? The question is, what is the American way of war, and how is it unique? And beginning in the 1920s, particularly with the creation of aircraft technology that seemed to provide the ability to let me just take a step back. World War I, what is it defined by, particularly on the Western Front, that's in most people's imaginations? Trench warfare. So once the aircraft is created, or it's created earlier, but once it advances, becomes metal, has accurate bomb sights, blah, blah, blah. There's this dream in the United States that planes will be able to fly over trenches and be able to very, very strategically and with precision bomb particular nodes in the enemy economy and end wars both cheaply and efficiently and humanely. And I think this is what you have to understand, that this becomes the ideology that really defines military thinking in the American empire in the 1940s and beyond. I'm actually writing a piece about this for Jacobin right now. But so McNamara and defense intellectuals and more recent efforts toward military transformation and even more recent use of things like drones is, in my opinion, just the outgrowth of this century-old tradition, which is to distinguish the quote-unquote American way of war through its humanity and its efficiency and its economy. And so I think this is a dream in the United States that, part connected to American exceptionalism is the argument that America is exceptional partially because even when we fight wars, we don't kill everyone. We do it.
And we fight rationally.
Right. We fight rationally. But the important point is that it's not just we fight rationally, is that to fight rationally is to fight morally. That's the important point about American war, I think. That's the dream. And that separates it from Germany, and that separates it from France and the UK, is that Americans think that we will be able to clear the fog of war. That is unique.
And so basically is that we began from this very little nucleus, right, of we had these mathematicians and, scientists, and we said, the Air Force took them aside and said, we need you to basically help us min-max, bombing shit. And we're going to we want to create as much destruction as possible and kill as many of them as possible with as little bombs as possible. And, we want to, so they basically, the Air Force, was the primary driver, working with Rand Corporation, and Curtis LeMay was the first kind of military overseer appointed to it, right? And so they wanted to approach this problem of these bombs, right? And how many, where do they bomb and things like that. So, they have this very little nucleus, right? And so these mathematicians and they sat down and they created these little theories to basically map it out like a game and to decide, through a chart of all the different possible decisions that people could take of what would be the best ones to do, right? And so that's the beginning of game theory. And then immediately the people who invent it, von Neumann, is they realize that, okay, actually all of economic society can be modeled like this. And so they take this one little nucleic idea about, how to min-max casualties from nuclear bombs, and they expand that. And that's how our whole, economic society is governed now, is according to that model.
Right. So basically, that's pretty much right on. It starts during the war, right? Because you want to be able to literally, American bases are too far. It really starts, I think, more with the war in Japan than the war in Europe. So it's American bases are far from Japan, and you need to figure out the precise bomb load and the precise gasoline load and the precise weight in order to be able to travel to Japan and travel back and bomb it. And so you get the development of operations research or systems analysis beginning during the war. And so von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern published their theory of games and economic behavior, I believe in 1942, but it's reprinted in 1944 and becomes this very influential thing. But one thing that I want, and leads to exactly what you just mentioned, but one thing that I do want to emphasize is that the people who created this, the people like von Neumann and Morgenstern, they're I think more sophisticated than the generations of economists that came after, because when they're being trained in Austria or Germany in the 20s and the 30s, there's not enough. You can't just read in economics, right? They're also very familiar with philosophical debates, the various methodological fights, the Methodenstreit that happen over the course of the early 20th century. And when they're promoting this economic thinking, I think it's important to emphasize is that someone like von Neumann
is that he knows what like a model is like scientifically. Is that he has a concept, a philosophical concept of what it means to model something using a game. That isn't just, it's the same thing.
Yes.
He doesn't identify, he understands that what a model is and how it limits.
Exactly. He's philosophically sophisticated. So he would never say, as other later generations, I think someone like Tom Schelling might be someone who you could accuse of doing this, or Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, or I don't even know like what economists are doing today. He wouldn't say this provides a course of action in quite the same way. He would say this provides a heuristic through which to understand a particular application of formal logic to a particular plan. But that if you're a decision maker, you're going to need to incorporate things like judgment and wisdom and things along those lines, right? So there's a sophistication there that I think my understanding becomes increasingly whittled down over the course of the second half of the 20th century, which is related to sort of the American fetishization of numbers. And there's a great scholar named Theodore Porter who wrote a book called Trust in Numbers, which sort of traces this, fetishization of economic thinking, this fetishization of quantification, this fetishization of modelization that takes hold in the United States for a variety of reasons. And most importantly, it's linked to funding, right? The government is going to fund you, or the university is going to fund you if you're able to articulate yourself as coming to quote unquote definite conclusions, as opposed to more romantic things that involve judgment or wisdom. So I think that we also need to be a little fairer.
This is something I just think that a lot of people get wrong in their discussions about especially capitalism today, and the disconnection of the stock market from what's going on, is that the tendency and the desire, we always want to blame things like greed, and we always want to talk about it as a financial thing exclusively of people trying to accumulate money, and certainly you can look at from the Wolf of Wall Street kind of perspective at like the individual level of what drives an investment banker or something, sure, but what you're talking about, I think, is the much deeper aspect of it, and that's like the real desire isn't to just like become rich or something. It's to actually make a model of all the decision making in the world, and to totalize that entire, all of those interconnections of decisions and interactions between groups and people, and to make it into an actual model that is able to simulate it. And that's the whole thinking behind it that really goes astray, is because now at the state level and the level of the technocrats and the planners and they confuse what it actually is. They reify it and they turn it into a substitution for the world. And so everyone's obsessed with the model.
Yeah, and today there's much more. Today, there's much more of a naive scientism, a naive faith in sort of scientific rationality that wasn't quite as present in the 1940s and the 1950s. I think computers are a real driver of that. The idea that like a massive computer will be able to simulate all of human decision making is an important driver of that. I think that the idea that politics, essentially the major political questions have been solved, which begins in the 1950s with, Edward Shill's The End of Ideology essay in, I believe, 55. That essay originally had a question mark, The End of Ideology, and Daniel Bell removes the question mark when he publishes The End of Ideology in 1960 and reaches its apotheosis with Fukuyama's, of course, The End of History in the late 80s, early 90s.
And didn't Fukuyama wasn't he at Rand Corporation? Fukuyama was a member of Rand Corporation, wasn't he?
Yes, I believe his early career was spent at Rand. Yeah. Yeah.
So you could definitely there is this obsession, with that modeling aspect, and I think that's still going on. Is that's the big problem really with social media today? Is that's the deeper intent and thinking about what its possibility is. I mean, that's why like you have Palantir and companies like that. I think that's what they're really driven by, is not just surveillance or anything. I mean, this is why I think Snowden, he didn't really come through for people, and they didn't get what he was on about. They weren't able to sort of comprehend exactly what he was talking about. People, we just have an idea that the government is collecting a lot of data about us, and we don't really care because it doesn't really seem to be used in a direct way against us.
Right.
But the whole point is to create these gigantic computer simulations of social, behavior in order to base engineering efforts on.
Yeah, which I fundamentally think is ontologically impossible.
I agree with you.
I'm sorry?
I totally agree with you on that point.
Yeah, it's a chimera. It'll never happen. I mean, the problem is that there'll be tons of money diverted toward it, where other things ideally would have been spent on it. But I think it's like it'll just never happen. It's a ridiculous dream.
And I mean, they're just going to keep going at it, and it's definitely going to cause more and more problems. I think, and what the decisions they make based on it. It's just going to keep compounding, because this sort of thinking it drives everything. I mean, they set up all these projects, to fight in the Middle East, to have a war in the Middle East. They always do shit like this.
Right.
They create human terrain systems and all this bullshit in order to, fight the rational war.
Right.
And it's never rational, and it's always a disaster. And, that's the history of the Vietnam War. That's the history of the war in the Middle East. I mean, we can't get over it.
Right. And there's also, you have to remember, there's a lot of money in this, right? There's a lot of money spent on systems. There's a lot of money spent on weapon systems, computer simulations, computer systems that's tied up with trying to simulate a more rational war, right? So there is the economic imperative there. But I do think that the fundamental impulse for it isn't necessarily to become rich, but it is to fight this more rational and ultimately this more humane war, right? If you ask people why they devoted themselves to becoming a defense intellectual at Rand, I mean, very few of them are going to say to get rich. They're going to say because I want to make war more rational. I want to increase human happiness and decrease human death.
And it spreads over. That attitude spreads over a lot of our policymakers and people, our politicians. So even people want to. They can only understand that people are doing something bad if they have bad intentions or bad motivations, Right. So the tendency is for people to look at a politician, whether it be Hillary Clinton or John McCain or whoever, and we want to look at them and say, these people are super evil deep down. And I don't know. I mean, maybe I don't like Hillary Clinton. I'm sure that she's not a pleasant person, but I don't know if she's self-consciously an evil schemer, person wringing her hands together and coming up with all types of crazy shit. Is that these people on a psychological level, is they believe fundamentally that the way that they approach these problems and the way that they handle their own decision making, they believe that it's humanistic in nature and that it's for everyone's good.
Yeah. I think that's right. I mean, the Hillary Clinton and the sort of the level of the politician is almost a different thing. To be a politician is a different thing than to be an analyst at Rand.
Yeah.
But I mean, I definitely agree. The way that I put it once on Twitter is that someone like Samantha Power believes her own bullshit. She doesn't believe she's a tool of American imperialism. She believes she's saving babies around the world, right? And I think to truly understand these people and therefore to truly stop them, I think that you need to take them not necessarily at their own word because they obfuscate, but try to understand and empathize with the position they're in, because then you'll understand the motivations behind their actions. And I think it's very unlikely to be just pecuniary gain.
Yeah, I mean it's you could say it's delusional in a way. I don't know.
Right.
It's ideological. I mean, this is the true sense of the term ideological, and the way that Mannheim actually uses it in Ideology and Utopia is that he distinguishes between ideology and worldview, and he says that ideology is kind of the lower level of things, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And this is the more psychological, justifying aspect of it.
Well, it's a way to frame the world, right? What all these people in the 20s are basically confronting is the problem of the mass media and mass communication, where there's so much information coming at. Okay, so it's that and the rise of a mass politics. And there's so much information coming at the Democratic constituency, which is now larger and more engaged in politics. And then they're asking, like, what do you do, right? And one of the answers is ideology as a way to sort of frame the overwhelming complexity of what actually happens in the world is to make them meaningful is through ideology, right? And I think everyone has an ideology. And one of the sickest things, one of the, I think, most damaging and grossest things about post-1945 American liberalism is that it pretends to be above ideology. And when it, like any form of human thought, it's profoundly ideological about its priors and its assumptions. And you see that today with nonsense about, the return of tribalism, or nonsense about like how everything shouldn't be politicized. It's total garbage, but it totally emerges from this idea that it's possible to step outside of history and just, come to some sort of rational conclusion about what is capital G good for most people in the world. And I think this is one of the things that has let liberals govern for so long, but also like why they're in such chaos now, because they don't know what to do when people are basically saying your beliefs are bullshit, because they've never considered their political convictions to be true beliefs, but just to be a representative rationality.
And you had a tweet too. I don't know if you want to get into. You had a controversial tweet that you made the other day. I don't even know how controversial you could actually say it is, but let's
get into it.
You said the other day that I just saw you post that there was something that you were worried about socialists today and how they can't really relate to the deeper idea of socialism except through getting free healthcare, right. And that you were worried about that. Apparently, I don't know, but your followers seem to get mad about that for some reason. But it's the same thing. It's like in the same way that we were talking about the alienation that the defense intellectual and this type of person goes through. It's the same exact thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't trying to be insult, and also I guess I used the phrase "young left." I just meant people under like 40. So I'm sure, like, I could see why some 22-year-old thought I was condescending to them, but certainly didn't mean that. But I mean, I was just referring to the fact that, like, throughout American history, whenever particular like wins have been achieved, and I was in that instance thinking about the end of the large-scale troops on the ground in Vietnam and the ultimate end of the draft and the creation of the all-volunteer forces, that has a deflating effect on young left-wing movements, and that's all I was referring to. And it's especially because in this country, like the main engine of transformation is the achievement of a particular goal. There's no like real socialist movement with a series of institutions and groups, bowling groups, playwright groups, things like that, which is what vibrant socialist movements have had in the North Atlantic context throughout history. And so I was just saying, like, I'm a little anxious about the achievement of a particular goal leading to the deflating of the young socialist movement. But I don't know. I guess a lot of people got upset at that. Maybe I was wrong. I'm always willing to think that.
I just think it's everybody's on edge. Everybody's on edge these days because everybody is going through something apparently with their beliefs, and they're all realizing that their beliefs are very I guess not particularly strong or able to kind of hold up given the current world situation. So I think that...
What do you mean? Do you mind expanding on that?
I think that it's just a general thing is that people sort of, they realize that, they don't believe as much as they think they do because everything is all based around, everybody believes everything very, very strongly and sincerely. Everybody thinks of themselves as being very principled and having this very deep core of spiritually energizing a reservoir of like true, sincere, principled beliefs. And I just don't think that most people have that at all. And I think that really is that people have very shallow kind of ideological convictions about things that they pick up from various places, and they use basically for social reasons in order to facilitate their movement through life, and that they confuse that with beliefs. And then in a situation like with coronavirus and riots and all this stuff that's been happening this year, as people just kind of realize that okay, none of that matters. Like what I think I believe, it doesn't matter, and I can't actually say anything really about what those beliefs are beyond kind of like the most superficial buzzwords. And is they realize that they're not that their foundation as a person, like intellectually, with regards to moral and political issues, is that they realize that it's more it's shakier, less substantial than they probably believed in previous years.
Yeah, I don't exactly know. I mean, there's just no like strong political education in this country. So that's what I was talking about that with my friend the other day. I mean, it's just that like, where do these beliefs come from if there's not like a political education, like vaguely from your high school history class, which is like vaguely center right. It's just very difficult. And I understand why people might have shallow political convictions, because what else would they have? But I didn't quite understand the anger at that tweet. I think I must still be missing something, because I didn't say this is what socialists believe. It's like my anxiety over, being in this world, but, it seems to really offend people.
Because you're right. I think people are mad because you're right, and they, people don't want to confront these kinds of, challenges right now in this situation, is because they want to be able to take comfort in these pre-established, belief systems that they have, and they aren't able to, because they're actually being challenged by history.
Right. And I guess what I was just saying is that like a belief in universal healthcare does not equate to a socialist politics.
Yeah.
It just doesn't. And so the question is like, I guess what I was trying to say inarticulately is all this fervor for universal healthcare, does that mean there is like a robust socialist politics? And if we're even using that term, what does a robust socialist politics really even indicate? I don't know. I was just trying to raising the question. But I didn't really expect the response or mean to offend.
But this is a general problem throughout, especially, it extends across what everyone is doing on the political spectrum, however you want to conceptualize it. But I mean, it's sort of like this is the nature of this neoliberalism, technocracy and social opinion consensus manufacturing. This is the nature of it all, isn't it? I mean, it's not really, it's geared towards the beliefs of all these people not really mattering. And so
right.
It's like, how can you expect anyone to have, genuine belief in socialism, or a genuine belief in like, cultural nationalism or anything like that? You can't expect people to have a sincere, deep belief about that, I don't think. And I think most people don't. And I think that, that's kind of like how it's all been set up. Like we've been talking since, social sciences in the early 20th century started putting that process in motion.
Yeah, and that was one of the motivations, at least for me, behind my work, is that I was getting frustrated. I came of age. I came of age in the era of the Iraq War and the Iraq War protests, and I absolutely respect the protesters during Iraq, and I participated with them, but it didn't really matter. And so I found it annoying on the left, at least in relation to national security, that there was always this focus on like mass protest building and mass movement, when like if Iraq showed anything, it just showed how disconnected these decisions are from any form or expression of popular democracy. So what I wanted to do was understand like how it came to be that all these experts came to exert such influence, and with the ultimate goal, I guess, being of like helping my fellow lefties or socialists appreciate the need of building cadre who could like manipulate the levers of power directly should have Bernie Sanders ever win. And I think if Bernie would have won the primary, I think it would have been interesting to see, whether the lack of, I guess, left technocrats or left experts would have hindered his program, which I believe he would have had to transform U.S. foreign policy. And I just want, I guess, the left to think more strategically about what we're doing. And I guess that tweet was part of that broader effort of mine.
Yeah, and I don't think that will ever happen with any move. I mean, I'm speaking from personal experience of just like I don't see. There's no mass movement that's ever going to, happen that's going to be able to go beyond the limitations of this kind of thinking. As in order for a mass kind of movement to exist, it has to think like this inherently, regardless of what its opinions are about things, right? It has to function at only this level. So, it sort of is, you and me and anybody else who has this realization. I mean, this is exactly the realization of, these defense intellectuals is, you have to kind of decide whether or not you're going to help the elite do it right and stop worrying so much about whether or not people understand what's going on in the world, or you have to, think of some other way to go about things.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that personally, like, you need both. You do need that popular pressure, and particularly in this country at this moment, electoral pressure. But you also need people to do things like argue in the halls of power for the dismantling of, 300 American military bases or something along those lines. So I think that like a vibrant socialist politics would only be possible when you have both sides of that equation. And the left, so far and so long removed from power, has focused mostly on the grassroots agitation, which is necessary but not sufficient, as they might say in the social sciences.
And I think that's you're right, but I think that anybody who gets to the level of being able to argue in the halls of power, I think that they're going to just basically become totally liberalized in the way that all these other intellectuals have. Is that if they're actually able to work at that level, is that they're going to realize that the best way to work at that level is basically by being a part of it and working in its system and that. So you're never. I don't think there's going to ever be someone who's in the halls of power arguing with the power. It's if you're there, you're going to only get there by joining it.
Well, certainly today. I mean, like, I think this is a generations-long project, and this is why socialists need to be serious about building institutions that will be able to create a significant number of cadre. Because if you're the only socialist in a room of 15 people, you're right. But if you're one of 7, you're less right, And so I think like that's going to have to be, basically you need an integrated strategy that takes all elements of society into account. Like you need socialist newspapers.
You need systems analysis.
I'm sorry?
You need systems analysis.
No, I don't think you need systems analysis. You need movements. And movements have, elements of political education. There's unions. There's mass grassroots. There's, leagues for socialists to hang out. There's it's a way of life. And we just don't have that in this country and haven't had it for a while. So absent those sorts of institutions, I think it'll be very tough to shape things.
No, I understand your thinking about this. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, you do need that in order to actually have different kind of societies, that you actually need to transform all society, is that you can't just do it from a top-down kind of way, but that's really all people want to do. That's all they think they have to do is, you go to protest and then you get angry. And that's enough. I mean, of course it's not, but I think, I want to thank you for coming on, doing this show. I know you have some other things you need to do, but, this has been a very fun talk for me. And I really, I have to recommend your book again and again, because it was a really great one. So, everybody, you can go check out Democracy in Exile. It's, thanks so much for talking to me, man.
Thanks so much, man. I'd love to come on in the future. I think these are really important conversations. But until then, have a great day.
Okay, you too, man. And I'll let you know about the future. Thank you.